At first, dating Stacy felt like winning the lottery. She was beautiful. She was obsessed with me. She wanted to spend every second together. But after a while, I started noticing something that... Hi, I'm Luke. I'm 34 years old now, and if you met me today, you'd see a guy who has his life completely on track. I work as a senior project manager at a digital marketing agency. It's a solid, stable career that I've worked hard to build, and I genuinely enjoy what I do. I dress well, keep myself clean-cut, and live in a nice, comfortable, modern apartment downtown. My personal life is exactly where it should be, too. I'm in a deeply loving, stable relationship with an incredible woman named Anna. And just last week, we started looking at engagement rings. On paper, I'm doing great, progressing well, and building a good life. But underneath this comfortable adult routine, beneath the neat future I'm planning with Anna, there is a dark cellar in my mind. If I close my eyes, the stable life I've built completely evaporates, and I'm pulled right back to the messy, broken kid I used to be. Before I get into this, I need to say something. For 16 years, I kept what happened completely buried. I never talked about it with my family, never told my friends, and for the longest time, I couldn't even bring myself to tell Anna. I convinced myself it was better left alone. But the older I get, the more I realize some things never really stay buried. We all look back on high school romance with a sense of fondness or nostalgia, but what I went through completely shattered that for me. Once you hear my story, I promise you that you will never look at high school dating or the girls you think are flawless the exact same way again. The year was 2010. It was an era of slide-open keyboard phones, listening to alternative rock through auxiliary cords, and the heavy biting scent of late autumn air hanging over the school parking lot. I can still hear the low, rhythmic hum of the local radio station playing through the cracked speakers of my old sedan, and most of all, I can still feel her presence. At the time, I didn't see the trap being laid out for me. I just thought I was the luckiest, most unremarkable guy in the entire state of Michigan who had somehow stumbled into a miracle. But whatever happened, it was too good to be true. And maybe it was. I didn't see the terrifying pattern beneath it all. I just saw a girl who looked at me like I was the only person in the world. It's almost jarring to look at my clean, organized life with Anna today and realize just how radically different I was back in 2010. In high school, I wasn't polished at all. I was an extreme introvert, painfully shy, and completely invisible to girls. Physically, I was about 5 feet 10 inches, but I slouched so much to avoid drawing attention to myself that I barely looked it. I had a lanky, unathletic frame, pale skin from spending winters glued to a screen, and a soft, forgettable face. The mere thought of talking to a girl made my chest tighten with anxiety. I spent almost all my time inside my own head, or staying up until 3 a.m., playing Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 2 on my Xbox 360 in my room. My lifestyle completely reflected that total lack of effort. My bedroom floor was a permanent maze of laundry. I regularly rolled out of bed 10 minutes before the morning bell, and I'd throw on whatever dark gray hoodie was closest to the top of the pile without checking a mirror. My hair was a messy, uncombed map of bedhead that I hid under a baseball cap. And if I skipped a shower on a lazy weekend because I was gaming, I didn't care. I preferred being invisible because it was safe. But senior year has a way of bringing a quiet, aching kind of loneliness. Watching everyone else around me forming couples, going on dates, and having girlfriends only made that weight feel heavier, constantly reminding me of what I was missing. And out of everyone, the only girl I ever truly noticed, the one I had a massive, silent crush on for years, was Stacy. Everyone at Oak Ridge High knew Stacy, but she wasn't the casual, laid-back girl next door. She was a striking beauty who stood a commanding 5 feet 7 inches, with an effortlessly graceful posture and a slender figure that turned heads the second she walked into a room. Her skin was incredibly clear and smooth, almost catching the dull fluorescent lights of the school. She had thick, honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders in glossy waves, and she was always up to date on every fashion trend, wearing stylish clothes, tailored jeans, and expensive jewelry. She constantly radiated a clean, sophisticated scent of vanilla and high-end perfume. She looked like the absolute definition of care and hygiene, making the physical contrast between us almost laughable. There was this weird pattern with Stacy, though. She always dated the kind of guys nobody else could compete with. Athletes, popular seniors, guys everybody knew. But for some reason, none of the relationships ever lasted very long. 4 to 5 months at most, and then suddenly they'd break up. Nobody ever seemed to know exactly what happened. The weirdest part was that the guys always looked exhausted afterward, while Stacy just quietly moved on like nothing had changed. Back then, I honestly couldn't understand it. I kept thinking, how could anyone possibly want to leave a girl like her? The day I finally gathered the courage to speak to her was a freezing Tuesday in early November of 2010. Class had just ended, and the hallway was a chaotic sea of slamming lockers and shouting students. Stacy was standing by her locker, looking like a magazine cutout in a beautiful wool coat, adjusting her bag. I remember watching her from about 10 feet away, feeling this sudden, suffocating wave of frustration with myself. I was so sick of being the ghost in the hallway, sick of watching life happen from the sidelines. Something inside me just snapped. I realized I wasn't any better off anyway. I was already completely invisible, so I had absolutely nothing to lose. It was a total now or never, do or die moment. Shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I forced my legs to walk up to her. "Hey, Stacy," I muttered. My voice cracked completely, and a hot flush of embarrassment immediately crept up my neck. I waited for her to look annoyed, or to give me that polite, dismissive glance you give to a total stranger. But instead, she turned around completely and looked at me with this quiet, genuine politeness. There was no judgment in her expression, no hint of making fun of me. She just smiled softly and said, "Hey, Luke." My brain completely short-circuited. The fact that she even knew my name, let alone who I was an absolute shocker. I swallowed hard, my hands buried deep inside the unwashed pockets of my oversized gray hoodie, my palms slick with sweat. I struggled to find my words, stammering through the absolute nerves clogging my throat. I was just thinking, maybe tomorrow evening we could go grab a burger or something at that old run-down diner down on Route 4. I don't know if maybe you'd want to go out with me. Like, come with? As soon as the clunky words left my mouth, I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Stacy didn't laugh, and she didn't roll her eyes. She just stood there, her deep brown eyes locking onto mine, and she took a bit of a pause. A heavy silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. The roaring noise of the hallway seemed to completely fade into background static. In those few seconds of absolute silence, my heart sank straight into my stomach. I completely panicked, entirely certain that she was going to say no and completely shatter my world. I braced myself for the polite rejection, the fake excuse about being too busy. Then, out of nowhere, her smile widened just a bit, looking unbelievably friendly and warm. She tilted her head and said, "Yeah, sure, Luke, I would. That actually sounds really nice. You can pick me up tomorrow around 6 p.m., okay?" I stared at her, my mouth slightly open, my brain completely failing to process reality. "Are you sure?" "What? Really?" I blurted out, the words tumbling out of me naturally in sheer disbelief. She just laughed a soft, musical laugh, nodded, and said, "Yeah, really." I stood there completely paralyzed by pure euphoria as she walked away, leaving a trace of her expensive perfume in the air. I was the invisible, messy kid, and I had somehow just landed a date with the most attractive, captivating girl in school. Our first few dates felt like an absolute dream. We started going out to all kinds of places, not just the cheap diner on Route 4, but occasionally some finer restaurants in the next town over. Honestly, I didn't exactly have much money back then, so keeping up with all the dinners started getting hard, but Stacy was incredibly genuine about it. She'd notice me checking my wallet and insist on contributing, seamlessly splitting the bill or slipping her own money across the table so I wouldn't feel stressed. When we were out, she completely ignored the rest of the world to focus entirely on me. She didn't care about school gossip or popularity. She wanted to know about my late-night gaming, why I sat alone, and what I thought about when I couldn't sleep. She listened with a fierce, undivided attention that was completely addictive. Within a week, we were inseparable, and our relationship shifted into the late-night hours. Around midnight, my slide phone would buzz, and I'd open it to hear her voice whispering under her covers. We would stay on the line until 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes just listening to the quiet sound of each other's breathing in the dark. For the first time in my life, my loneliness evaporated. I felt entirely seen and wanted by a girl who seemed way out of my league. During those first couple of weeks, I started noticing something else about her. Slowly and gradually, it became clear that she actually liked me for exactly who I was. She seemed genuinely fascinated by my messy, uncombed hairstyle, and never once hinted that I should change it or try a bit harder. To be honest, I found it kind of weird. My inner thoughts kept telling me that any girl, especially one as neat and fashionable as Stacy, would naturally want me to clean up a little, groom myself, and put some effort into my appearance. But for some strange reason, she really loved the way I looked without any effort. Sometimes she would call me out of the blue for a last-minute hangout, and since I could never say no to her, I'd rush out the door exactly as I was. I'd show up to meet her in fully wrinkled cargo shorts, faded t-shirts, or hoodies with cuffs that were practically tearing at the seams. Careless, unpolished looks that guys usually avoid like the plague when they're trying to impress a girl. Yet, for some odd reason, She always looked at me with this quiet, intense approval. It was a subtle buildup, a strange little trait that I shrugged off because I was just too blinded by how lucky I felt. It was the end of our second week together when the first major shift occurred, and looking back, this is where the true weirdness began. We were supposed to go out to a nicer restaurant for our 2-week anniversary. Wanting to actually impress a girl who always looked so well dressed, I decided to make a massive effort. I took a long shower, scrubbed down, carefully combed my bedhead, put on a brand new flannel shirt that I had actually taken the time to iron, and used a heavy splash of my dad's cologne. When she got into the passenger seat of my car, I turned to her with a confident smile, expecting her to be thrilled. But Stacy just stared at me, and the warm smile she usually wore instantly vanished. Her eyes scanned my neatly combed hair, the stiff collar of my pressed shirt, and the clean, artificial scent filling the car. She looked deeply disappointed, almost distant. When I nervously asked if I looked stupid, Stacy paused, then reached over. Her fingers gripped the ironed fabric of my shirt, firmly pulling me toward her with surprising force, until her face was buried deep in the crook of my neck, inhaling with a strange, heavy intensity. When she pulled back, her expression had softened into something overwhelming and possessive. She whispered that I didn't look stupid, but that I didn't look like her Luke. She immediately slid her fingers into my neatly combed hair, intentionally tugging and messing it up until it was completely chaotic again. With a deep, satisfied look in her eyes, she told me never to do that again. She whispered that she hated all that fake, clean stuff, and that she liked me better, natural. She said she loved my wrinkled hoodies, my messy hair, and the way I smelled when I had been up all night gaming. She said that was what was real to her. A massive rush of warmth flooded my chest, blinding me to how bizarre this actually was. Here was this incredibly beautiful, perfectly clean, high-fashion girl, telling me that she was completely drawn toward my lack of effort and messiness. She was giving me ultimate permission to be my laziest, most careless self, and to an insecure 18-year-old boy, it felt like the ultimate validation. By the end of November, I was entirely consumed by her. My grades were cratering, I was skipping homework to talk to her, and my room was an absolute disaster, but I didn't care because I was intoxicated by her attention. One freezing Friday night, we were sitting in my parked car at the edge of the school athletic fields. The stadium lights were off, the windows were heavily fogged up from our breath, and the dashboard cast a dim, eerie red glow over us. Stacy was resting her head tightly against my chest. I had been wearing the exact same dark gray hoodie for 3 days straight. It was worn, stained from energy drinks, and smelled heavily of stale sweat. Stacy had her hand slid entirely inside the front pocket of the hoodie, her bare skin pressed flat against my stomach, listening intently to my heartbeat. She whispered into the dark, asking me to promise that I would never, ever leave her, and I swore it to her without a single doubt. She shifted, pressing her lips against my jawline, and I noticed her skin felt incredibly warm, almost feverish. She clung to me with a desperate, crushing strength that felt entirely too heavy for a girl her size, whispering that it was good because she could never let me go. I wrapped my arms around her, burying my face in her hair. At the time, it made me feel invincible. But looking back now, sitting in my quiet, comfortable apartment next to Anna all these years later. I realized that was the exact moment the warmth started to feel a little too hot. That was the first time I realized something was deeply, terribly off. After that night in the car at the edge of the athletic fields, the final weeks of November slowly gave way to a freezing Michigan winter. I still tried to keep up with my normal routines back then, but my focus just started to drift. I remember logging onto Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 2 with my online friends like I always did, sitting there with my headset on, but my eyes would constantly look down at my phone sitting on the mattress next to me. Pretty soon, I was backing out of multiplayer lobbies or ducking out of our usual late-night matches entirely. I remember getting messages over Xbox Live from guys I'd played with for years saying, "Dude, where you at? We need one more for search." I'd just type back a quick excuse about being tired, turn off the console, and lie there in bed staring at the ceiling, impatiently waiting for my phone to finally light up. My schoolwork followed the exact same path. I'd still do my homework, but I'd turn in a history worksheet a day late because I had stayed up until 3 a.m. talking to her. Or I'd get distracted halfway through a minor reading assignment for AP Literature because I was too busy thinking about her to focus on the pages. Within a few weeks, the incomplete work began to accumulate. My English teacher actually pulled me aside after class one afternoon, tapping her pen against a stack of my papers, asking why my grades had steadily slipped from comfortable B's down to precarious D's. But back then, I didn't care. That cost was absolutely nothing to me. I was into her so deeply, so utterly consumed, that I would have willingly thrown away a lot more than just my grades, just to keep things exactly as they were. Things always got truly intense after midnight during those long, intimate phone calls. We'd sink into conversations that stretched for hours, talking about the most random, casual things, mapping out a vague future together, or just trailing off into a heavy silence over the line. It was during these calls that she started dropping this soft, low giggle into the speaker. It was a very distinct, quiet laugh, a little off-pitch, almost like a private inside joke she was having with herself. I naturally started to notice that that particular giggle always came right before she'd casually guess something specific about what I was doing right that second. She'd laugh and say, "You're still wearing that gray hoodie with the frayed cuffs, aren't you?" Or she'd guess that I had skipped dinner and was eating stale cereal straight from the box. To be honest, it would freak me out for a second, but I absolutely loved it because I was just too far gone. I was so incredibly into her that I rationalized it instantly, telling myself she just knew my lazy teenage habits so perfectly that it was like a sixth sense. There were actually several other instances during those weeks where she caught me off guard like that. I can't recall each and every single moment now, but the occurrences started bleeding together into this strange pattern. But then, there were moments that went beyond simple habit guessing, moments I couldn't explain away, no matter how hard I tried. Like this one time in the library on a freezing Thursday afternoon during a free period. I had gone to the very back row to get away from the noise of the hallways, sitting behind a massive stack of old encyclopedias. I was completely alone in an empty aisle and pulled a small bag of sour gummy worms out of my backpack. I hadn't told a soul where I was going, and from where I was sitting, I was entirely hidden from view. 2 minutes after I sat down, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Stacy. It started with a typed-out description of her signature laugh. Giggle. Are you going to save any of those sour worms for me? I jerked my head up, looking down the long, empty aisles of bookshelves, fully expecting to see her blonde hair peeking out from around a corner. There was absolutely no one there. My heart started to beat a little faster. I sat there under the dull fluorescent lights, desperately trying to construct a solid explanation. I told myself that she must have seen me walk into the library earlier, or maybe I had accidentally mentioned wanting candy the day before. I forced myself to accept those clumsy excuses, because the alternative was something my brain simply wasn't ready to process. And besides, when I saw her at her locker an hour later, looking so normal and holding her books, she gave me a smile that was so incredibly warm and loving that the anxiety instantly dissolved into relief. For the next week or two, things actually went back to feeling normal, erasing that weird afternoon in the library. We spent our weekends driving out to the frozen lake or sitting in the back booth of the Route 4 diner, sharing fries while she told me about her favorite movies. She was incredibly sweet, constantly reinforcing this idea that I was exactly what she wanted. I was completely hooked on her, totally dependent on that constant rush of validation. But by mid-January, the strange observations returned, and this time they crossed the line into impossible, psychologically invasive territory. One night, I was pacing around my bedroom in a state of quiet, unexplainable unease. I walked over to my desk, switched off the small lamp, and sat heavily on the very edge of my mattress. The room was dark, lit only by the faint winter moonlight cutting through the cracks of the blinds. The exact millisecond my weight hit the springs, my phone lit up with a sharp hum. I answered it, and before she even said a single word, that low, distinct giggle cut straight through the speaker. Over time, those giggles had stopped feeling playful and started getting under my skin. In that dead silent atmosphere, hearing that specific laugh hit me entirely differently. It genuinely freaked me out, sending a sudden spike of panic through my chest because of how echoing and quiet the house was. It felt less like a harmless habit and more like someone whispering right over my shoulder in the dark. "It's pitch black in your room, baby," she murmured softly right after. "Turn the lights on. I don't like talking to you in the dark." I froze, my entire body locking up in the cold air. My window blinds were pulled tight, overlapping each other, and the lock was flipped. There was zero physical line of sight into my room from anywhere outside. Shaking, I pressed the phone tighter to my ear and asked, "Wait, how did you know that?" She just let out a soft sigh and said, "Oh, you have no idea. When you're deeply in love with someone, you can actually feel them, baby. You can feel their every movement. Love just makes you feel that way." Hearing those words, I unwillingly just fell for it. It was a profoundly unnerving, suffocating feeling that settled directly into my chest, a quiet weight that I couldn't shake. But I was just too into her, too weak to back off or question it any further, so I let the discomfort pass and accepted her explanation. I told myself the microphone on my phone must be incredibly sensitive, that she had heard the tiny creak of the bed springs through the receiver and just guessed the rest. I let myself believe the lie just to keep the peace. It's hard to put into words how deeply that messes with your head. But from that night on, her laugh stopped being a sweet little quirk. It became a permanent trigger for pure anxiety. The breaking point of that entire month happened on a brutally cold night near the end of January. A thick sheet of black ice had frozen over the window panes, and the entire house was dead quiet. I was laying in my bed under my heavy blankets, the lights dimmed low, just winding down and relaxing after a long day. I was on a call with Stacy, lying there comfortable, just listening to her voice. We were having this quiet, intense conversation, but I had started feeling emotionally consumed by her attention, even though I still craved it constantly. Stacy was speaking in that low, hypnotic whisper, mapping out our lives, talking about the future with an intense level of focus, trying to break up the heavy, tense atmosphere of the call. I let out a tired sigh and jokingly muttered, "Babe, I wish you were just here in the room right now so I could stop talking to this plastic screen." The line went dead silent. There was no background hum from her room, no rustle of sheets, just the empty hiss of the digital connection. Then, out of the quiet, came that low, distinct giggle. Hearing that laugh cut through the absolute stillness made my skin crawl. It was a cold, sinking sensation that left me completely paralyzed. "I can be," she said calmly. I chuckled nervously, shifting under my blankets, assuming she was just being playful or talking about us hanging out the next evening. I told her I'd just see her at school in the morning, but she didn't laugh back. Her voice remained entirely level, completely affectionate, and utterly intimate as she whispered, "Turn the call off, babe." "Why?" I asked, utterly confused. "What's going on?" "Oh, baby, come on," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Oh, come on, just do it." I hesitated for a second, then closed the phone. The sharp click felt deafening in the quiet room. Total, absolute silence settled over my bedroom. A heavy, suffocating panic hit me out of nowhere, every instinct in my body screaming that I needed to get out of that room. I sat up on the edge of the mattress, my bare feet touching the cold floorboards, left wondering why she had even asked me to hang up like that. It made absolutely no sense. And while I was sitting there in the dark, trying to figure it out, a sound cut through the stillness. It wasn't a loud, dramatic bang or the terrifying smash of breaking glass. It was just a soft, rhythmic, incredibly deliberate tapping against the glass of my bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. I felt terrified, frozen in place. My legs felt like blocks of lead as I forced myself to cross the room. Shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs, I slowly walked over to the glass. My breath was misting into a faint white cloud in the chilly air as I reached out with a trembling hand and slowly parted the plastic blinds. For a second, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My breath caught right in my throat, and my brain scrambled, entirely refusing to process reality. It was Stacy, standing right in front of me. She was balanced perfectly on the narrow roof ledge outside my window. The freezing Michigan wind was howling, kicking up flurries of snow around her, but she didn't look cold at all. Her honey blonde hair was perfectly in place, her clear skin catching the pale amber glow of the street lamp from the empty road below, and she was wearing her beautiful wool coat. She wasn't shivering, she wasn't panicking, and she wasn't angry. She was just standing out there on that narrow ledge, utterly human, looking through the glass and smiling at me with that intense, overwhelming affection. I stood there in utter shock, my mind fracturing. To give you context on why I was breaking out in a cold sweat, you have to understand my bedroom setup. My room was on the second story, directly overlooking the backyard. For a person to even get onto that narrow window ledge, they would have had to climb a heavy metal drain pipe running up the corner of the brick exterior, and then carefully shimmy across a narrow 6-inch concrete molding that ran just below the sills. It was a dangerous, awkward climb that even a fully grown adult would struggle with in broad daylight. There was absolutely no logical way she should have been out there, and I was spinning out over how it was physically possible. I scrambled to unlock the latch and slide the heavy window up. "Hey, what the hell are you doing here?" I blurted out, trailing off in absolute shock. Stacy just looked at me, a playful but unsettling smile on her face. "Hey, aren't you happy to see me?" "Oh, yeah, of course," I stammered, my brain blank. She whispered, "Oh, come on, let me in, babe." Yeah, sure, I'm sorry, come on in," I muttered, quickly reaching out and firmly pulling her into the warmth of the room. The second her feet hit the carpet, I stared at her, my voice shaking as the confusion tangled up my words. "Wait, I still don't understand. How come you are here? How did you get here?" She just tilted her head, her eyes locking onto mine with a mix of creepy playfulness as she stepped closer. "Oh, baby, does it matter? What matters is that I'm here with you." All my logical defenses withered away. Her body felt incredibly warm, almost feverish against the winter air, and she clung to me with that deep, crushing strength that completely bypassed my fear and triggered that familiar, addictive relief. Even today, 16 years later, living a stable, predictable life, those moments still don't make any sense to me. I was too cowardly to press her for the truth back then because deep down, I was terrified of what the answer might be. But as I held Stacy in the dark while the winter wind howled outside, a quiet, permanent dread settled deep into my gut. I finally realized that I wasn't just in a high school relationship. I was being totally surrounded. The morning after Stacy stood on my window ledge, the sun came up over a gray, frozen landscape, and my brain immediately went to work doing what infatuated teenagers do best, rewriting reality. I sat at my desk, staring out at the narrow concrete molding beneath my window, desperately trying to convince myself there was a normal explanation for what had happened. I told myself she was just incredibly determined and athletic. Maybe she had found a way to leverage herself up the drain pipe. Maybe she had spent hours planning it just to pull off a crazy, dramatic, romantic surprise. I convinced myself that I was the one who had overreacted, that my midnight panic had magnified a dangerous, albeit human, stunt into something impossible. The sheer weight of my attachment to her acted like an anchor, dragging down every red flag my intuition tried to raise. So the relationship continued, but the foundation had shifted. A permanent, low-frequency layer of discomfort settled beneath everything we did, turning the initial rush of the romance into something heavy and exhausting. By early February, Stacy's affection began to morph into a quiet, total presence that occupied every spare second of my day. The change didn't arrive with angry blow-ups or dramatic explosive outbursts. Instead, it was a slow, quiet accumulation, a relentless, non-stop drip of check-ins wrapped in the softest, most loving tones imaginable. She simply wanted access to every single corner of my life. Our daily texting, which had always been frequent, intensified into a constant, suffocating stream that required a baseline level of tracking I had never experienced before. If I went to the grocery store, my phone would buzz, asking where I was. If I told her I was just heading out to pump gas, She'd reply within seconds, wanting to know what I was doing. At first, I found it incredibly flattering. I was an insecure high school kid, and having a beautiful girl constantly checking in on me felt like a badge of honor. But within a couple of weeks, the novelty dissolved into a grinding, constant irritation, which quickly gave way to pure exhaustion. The horror didn't come from the anger or intensity of her words. It came entirely from their relentless frequency. She was never hostile. If I left my phone in my backpack during a long afternoon class, I'd return to find a string of texts along with a few missed calls waiting on the screen. When I called her back, her voice wouldn't be sharp. She would just sound incredibly small, almost fragile, whispering over the line that she was just worried, that she just missed me so much, and that she got scared when she couldn't feel where I was. How do you fight that? How do you argue with someone who is smothering you under the guise of pure, unadulterated love? You don't. You just accept it, even as the walls start closing in. Living under this endless check-in cycle, a strange weight started settling over my shoulders. I began to develop this persistent, unsettling feeling as if I was under total surveillance. It was exactly like that chilling sensation they show in the movies, where some creep or weirdo is constantly monitoring his crush through hidden CCTV or secret cameras, tracking their every move from the shadows. I never felt truly alone anymore, even when I was by myself in an empty room. I gradually realized that there was never a single millisecond of the day where Stacy was not actively thinking about me or somehow tracking my state of being. The absolute certainty of her focus stopped being comforting. It became deeply invasive. During this claustrophobic stretch of winter, I began to notice a bizarre, deeply disturbing, hot and cold behavior from Stacy that completely threw me off. Looking back, maybe it was there all along, but I really only started noticing it pretty much during that winter. It created an intense sense of confusion, leaving me desperately curious about what was causing her to switch personalities from one day to the next. For instance, there was a weekend when I had stayed up until 4 a.m. playing Xbox, skipped my morning shower, threw on my old frayed gray hoodie, and let my bedroom fall into total disarray. When Stacy and I met up later that day, she was absolutely ecstatic. She was intensely affectionate, playful, and physically clingy, burying her face in my neck and practically purring while staying completely attached to my side. But a few days later, the exact opposite happened. I had a family gathering during the daytime, so I actually took the time to dress properly, shower, throw on clean clothes, and fix my hair. It was honestly really unlike me to put in that kind of effort, but I had to look neat for the family gathering. Later on that evening, I had to meet Stacy for a date, so I was still more or less in that same clean state from earlier. The exact second she stepped into my car, her entire demeanor inverted. She didn't completely shut down or ignore me, but she shifted into this incredibly flat, bare minimum mode. If I asked her how her day was or tried to start a conversation, she'd just reply with a dry, fine, or a quiet, staring blankly out the frost-bitten window into the dark winter night, entirely cold and emotionally withdrawn. Whenever she behaved that cold, I'd endlessly replay our time together in my head, agonizing over what I could have possibly done wrong. I knew I hadn't said anything offensive or acted distant, so her sudden freezing behavior made absolutely no sense. This bizarre back and forth happened a couple more times over the next 2 weeks. A messy, unwashed weekend meant a fiercely loving, adoring Stacy. A clean, put-together weekday meant a heavily detached version of her who barely engaged and only offered short, unenthusiastic one-word answers. After these identical reactions kept repeating, I noticed something very strange, hard to believe, and totally did not make any sense. I began to link her sudden shifts in mood to my own hygiene. I sat alone, wondering, is that even possible? Who pulls away from their boyfriend simply because he decided to wash his hair and clean himself up? I got so lost in my thoughts that I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't completely losing it. I needed to see if there was actually any truth to this insanity, so I decided to deliberately test the hygiene theory. I spent that Saturday afternoon doing something I rarely ever did back then, unless it was absolutely necessary. I went to a local men's salon. I got a nice haircut, had them shampoo my hair, and just generally cleaned myself up. When I got home, I dressed up well, putting a solid amount of effort into looking presentable. I wasn't trying to do a complete, ridiculous makeover, but I wanted to be noticeably fresh, clean, and distant from my usual lazy habits. I drove over to her house and waited at the curb. Sitting there, staring at her front door, I was practically begging the universe to prove me wrong. My mind was racing, thinking, please tell me I'm just being silly or stupid, that she's nothing like that and it's all just in my head. You know that exact feeling when you are just desperately hoping you're the one who's insane. When Stacy finally opened her front door and walked down the snow-lined driveway, she looked as beautiful as ever in her wool coat, her face completely lit up with this delightful, happy smile. But the exact second she opened the passenger door, stepped into the vehicle, and actually looked over at me, that warm expression just instantly died. Her face completely changed, dropping into this profound, hollow disappointment, almost a look of subtle disgust that she didn't even try to hide. She didn't lean over to kiss me or anything. She just quietly closed the door, slid over against the passenger panel, and stared straight ahead through the windshield. I told her she looked great, my heart hammering against my ribs. She just whispered that I seemed different, her voice completely flat, devoid of the usual warmth that typically defined her tone. I stammered, I wanted to look different for you today. How do you like it? Gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, she just muttered, yeah, you look good, but it came out in this totally dismissive tone, completely empty of any real interest. She didn't turn her head to look at me. She just stared at the dashboard, her voice dropping into a quiet, chillin' register as she told me I didn't smell like myself. An icy dread settled directly into my gut. Looking at this beautiful girl under the dull winter sky, I realized with absolute certainty that the ridiculous, impossible pattern was real. She didn't want me clean. She didn't want me put together. She wanted me decaying, messy, and broken down. Because of that horrifying certainty, I voluntarily began to isolate myself. I didn't drop my friends because Stacy demanded it. I dropped them because it was just easier to choose her and avoid the quiet, heavy withdrawals that happened whenever I tried to maintain a clean appearance or a life outside of her circle. It was easier to just stay messy, unwashed, and trapped in my room to keep her happy. My gaming friends stopped seeing my gamertag online entirely. My school counselors started sending warnings home about my slipping performance. One afternoon at my locker, an old friend of mine passed by, slamming my locker door shut with a smirk, joking that I had completely disappeared and asking if Stacy had me on a leash. I forced a laugh and dismissed it instantly, claiming I was just busy with AP classes. But as I watched him walk away down the crowded hallway, a sudden, sharp wave of loneliness hit me right in the chest. The atmosphere of that entire month felt completely claustrophobic. My memories of February are reduced to a blur of bleak winter evenings, dark country roads, and silent car rides where the heater hummed loudly against the freezing air. I was living on 4 hours of sleep a night, driven entirely by emotional exhaustion and the perpetual, rhythmic buzz of my phone against my car's plastic console. Worse, her insight into my daily movements began to cross into terrifying territory. One afternoon, I was sitting in the back row of my history class, staring blankly at the chalkboard. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, looked down at the screen, and sighed heavily when I saw it was a text from her. I just put it right back in my pocket, deliberately deciding to ignore it for a bit, just to have a single moment of peace. Less than 10 seconds later, it buzzed again. When I checked it, the screen read, "Why did you just pick up the phone and just put it back without answering my text? Are you ignoring me?" I froze completely, my heart leaping into my throat as a deep shudder ran through my chest. This couldn't be true. It was physically impossible. I looked around the classroom wildly, scanning the rows of desks and checking the hallway window. But Stacy wasn't even in this class period. She was on the completely opposite side of the school building. My inner thoughts scrambled in pure terror, completely unable to process how she could see my exact physical movements through solid brick walls. The sheer impossibility of it shook me to my core, leaving me trapped in a wave of nauseating panic that made it feel like the eyes of the entire world were locked onto me. Another night, after dropping her off, I decided to pull into a dark, empty parking lot near the athletic fields just to sit in the quiet for 10 minutes before heading home. My phone rang instantly. She murmured softly, asking if I was home yet. I lied, my voice shaking slightly as I stared out at the empty bleachers, telling her I had just walked through the front door. The line went quiet for a beat, and then she said, "No, you're not." I tried to argue, stammering that I was literally in my kitchen, but she repeated herself, her voice perfectly level, completely devoid of anger, but utterly terrifying in its certainty. She told me not to lie to her because it made her chest hurt. I didn't argue. I just put the car in drive and left. Whenever I told her I felt fine, she would counter with an immediate, "No, you don't." And the worst part was, she was always right. I felt completely exposed, systematically dissected by someone who claimed to love me more than anything. The final days of that month were a waking nightmare of emotional contradiction. I was caught in a psychological vice. On one hand, I felt intensely loved, deeply desired, and incredibly important to someone. On the other hand, I felt entirely trapped, systematically controlled, and completely vulnerable. The two emotions were so tightly tangled together in my chest that I couldn't pull them apart. Part of me was still fiercely in love with her, addicted to the moments when she would hold me and tell me I was her entire world. But looking at my bloodshot eyes and hollow cheeks in the bathroom mirror on a freezing Sunday morning, I could no longer ignore the truth. I wasn't ready to admit she was a monster, I wasn't ready to believe anything supernatural was happening. My teenage brain couldn't process a conclusion that extreme. But with a heavy, painful reluctance, I finally whispered the words out loud to the empty room, admitting to myself that something simply wasn't right. It was an agonizing admission, but once the thought was out there, it couldn't be taken back. The illusion had fractured. As I sat on the edge of my bed that afternoon, the constant, demanding buzz of my phone vibrating against the desk wood, my mind suddenly drifted backward. I found myself thinking about the rumors from the beginning of the school year. I remembered the stories about her previous boyfriends, the way people said they had looked completely hollowed out, perpetually exhausted, right before they abruptly dropped out, broke down, or suddenly moved away without much explanation. For the first time, I wasn't looking at those rumors as high school gossip. I was looking at them as a timeline. I began to wonder, with a rising sense of panic, if I was simply retracing the exact footsteps of the boys who came before me. And for the first time since November, I realized I needed to find out exactly what happened to them. The decision to actively look for answers didn't make me feel like some clever protagonist in a mystery movie. It just made me feel completely pathetic, isolated, and deeply embarrassed by my own thoughts. Over the next week, I found myself quietly slipping into the very back corner of the school library during my free periods, pulling down dusty old yearbooks from 2 or 3 years ago, trying to track down any guy who had dated Stacy before me. I actually managed to find the social media profiles and numbers of 2 other guys who used to be with her, but the second I reached out and subtly brought up her name, they completely shut me down. One of them literally hung up on me the moment I said her name, and the other sent a text telling me to never message him again before blocking my number entirely. Their absolute refusal to even speak about her sent a chill down my spine. I sat there at a scratched wooden library table, a pen rolling down my fingers as a wave of pure hesitancy and fear washed over me. I kept staring at the third name on my list, Marcus, a guy who had dropped out during his senior year. My inner thoughts were a total mess, endlessly questioning if I should even be talking about this, cringing at how incredibly embarrassing and stupid I would look trying to explain this to a total stranger. I mean, how do you even tell someone you think your girlfriend is tracking your exact physical movements through solid brick walls? But the desperation finally overrode the shame. I gathered whatever courage I had left and typed out a message to Marcus, practically begging him over text until he reluctantly agreed to meet me on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. He picked a rundown, half-empty diner just off the highway, miles away from the school district, almost as if he didn't want anyone from our town to see him there. I got there early, sliding into a cracked vinyl booth near the back, where a faint smell of burnt coffee and old grease hung heavily in the air, anxiously watching the front door every single time the little bell jingled above the glass. When Marcus finally walked in, he didn't look broken or unhinged, but the second he sat down across from me, he was surprisingly defensive and flat-out rude. He looked at me with a judgmental smirk and said, "Oh, so you're that quiet kid from school, right? The one who barely talks to anyone?" I just sat there, biting my tongue, completely caught off guard by his attitude, but I didn't care about his insults. I just needed to know the truth. I tried to clear my throat and smooth things over, starting with some basic small talk, but Marcus just rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed that he had wasted his afternoon on me. Finally, I couldn't take the tension anymore, and I just blurted out the question, asking him if he remembered his ex-girlfriend, Stacy. The exact second her name left my mouth, Marcus completely freaked out. He slammed his hands on the table, his face turning bright red as he stood up from the booth and started aggressively whispering at me, asking why the hell I was asking him about Stacy, why I was so bothered and concerned, and why the hell he should ever tell a kid like me anything about her. He was genuinely angry and about to walk right out the door, but out of sheer panic, I reached across the table and grabbed his sleeve to stop him and begged him to just look at me. I told him I had been under an insane amount of stress lately, that I was completely losing it, and that I just desperately needed some answers from him. Seeing the sheer terror and exhaustion in my eyes must have hit a nerve, because he slowly let go of my grip, looked around the quiet diner, and reluctantly sat back down into the booth. Once he settled back in, he tried to put up a front, acting dismissive and muttering that yeah, she was good, but I could tell he was just trying to brush it off. When I asked him why the two of them had actually broken up, he snapped back, asking why it even mattered and telling me to just lay it out and tell him what the hell was wrong with me instead of playing games. So I finally opened up and told him everything. I told him how she was always on my case, how I felt like I was constantly being watched and monitored every second of the day, and asked him if any of that had happened to him too. Marcus stared at me in total silence for a long time, his aggressive front completely evaporating as his eyes widened. He leaned forward and admitted that initially everything had gone perfectly with them too, but then it started getting incredibly intense and weird. He whispered that she always knew his exact moves, tracking everything he was doing throughout the day, which made him feel deeply uncomfortable and trapped. Hearing that validation made my head spin, but I knew I had to ask the one question that sounded completely insane. I leaned in and told him I was going to say something that might sound totally stupid, but asked if her mood shifts were ever related to his hygiene, like if she used to become completely cold and distant whenever he dressed well or cleaned himself up. The second I said that, Marcus started stammering, his hands visibly shaking as he looked at me in absolute shock. He whispered, "Oh wait, that happened with you too?" He told me he thought he was the only crazy one, that he had never spoken to a soul about it because he knew he would sound completely unhinged, but he couldn't believe I was going through the exact same stuff. He started recalling his own instances, explaining how whenever he used to get cleaned up, she would immediately turn cold, and how she would actually try to force him to be messy and unwashed, which he always found deeply weird because he actually cared about his hygiene. Marcus then looked at me with this hollow, exhausted expression and explained his ultimate realization. He said that when things got completely out of control and he felt like he was losing his mind, he noticed a definitive pattern. Whenever he deliberately chose to remain completely clean, groomed, and put together, she would stay totally distant, sending no messages and making no calls. He realized that keeping himself clean was the only thing that actually worked. It let him slowly drift out of her life without having to face whatever might happen if he tried to end things directly. He just had to stay clean until she completely lost interest. Sitting in that quiet diner, my inner thoughts were running wild in pure terror as the reality of it all crashed down on me. This was real. I wasn't the only one imagining it, and this impossible, terrifying pattern had happened in the exact same way to other people in the past. After Marcus left, I got back into my car and started the long, silent drive home through the melting snow, but my mind was completely consumed by conflicting thoughts. I found myself absolutely hating the reality of the conversation I had just experienced. A massive part of me was completely torn, because even though she was suffocating me, a part of me still didn't want to let her go. I had always dreamed of having a girl who wanted me this intensely, a girl who was always in my life and cared about me this much. But the point where I was right now was a living nightmare. This was not at all what I had imagined a real relationship to look like. The entire situation was systematically consuming me, destroying my peace, and leaving me trapped between a girl I still loved and a reality I could no longer stand. As my phone began to buzz on the dashboard with another soft, caring text from her, I looked at the screen through the dark winter evening, knowing I had a choice to make. I was going to test this blueprint for myself. The heavy silence inside my car felt completely different on the drive back from that diner. I stared at the road ahead as the windshield wipers swept away the freezing drizzle, my mind completely at war with itself. Marcus had just confirmed every single terrifying detail of what I was living through, providing a literal blueprint for my survival. Yet a massive part of me was completely torn. I hated how much she was consuming my life, but I also hated the thought of letting her go. I had spent so many years feeling invisible, and the drug of being Stacy's entire universe was an incredibly hard thing to walk away from. I didn't fully believe the hygiene theory made any logical sense. It sounded completely insane, but I was totally out of options, emotionally drained, and desperate enough to try anything. Over the next few weeks, I slowly began forcing myself to take back the basic routines I had completely abandoned. It didn't happen overnight. It was a grueling, gradual process of reclaiming pieces of my identity. I started forcing myself to wake up early enough to take a proper shower every morning. I cleaned the weeks of clutter and stale food wrappers off my bedroom desk. I threw out the frayed, unwashed clothes I had been hiding in, replacing them with clean, fresh shirts, and I actually made an effort to get a decent night of sleep. It was honestly so unlike me to do any of that, and maintaining that level of discipline made me feel like a totally different person inside. And just as Marcus had predicted, the shift in Stacy's behavior was almost instantaneous. She didn't become angry or confrontational. She just quietly began to fade away. But the absolute creepiest part of it all was that she didn't even have to meet me in person to see if I was clean. She could actually feel it over the phone. I would wake up, shave, get fully cleaned up, and when she called me later that day, her voice would immediately be completely flat and heavily detached. I didn't mention a single thing to her about being clean or changing my routines, but she just knew. It was so incredibly strange and unsettling to realize that she didn't need to look at me to track my hygiene. She could just feel it from miles away. Because of that, the constant, relentless stream of text messages that used to buzz my pocket every 20 minutes slowly began to stretch out, happening every few hours, then only a couple of times a day. But when she got really distant in between, God, I still used to miss her badly. There were so many nights I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at her name in my call logs, completely dying to pick up the phone and call her because I missed our late-night chats like crazy. I wanted that warmth back, but I would force myself to stop. gripping my hands together until my knuckles turned white, because I knew exactly what kind of nightmare I was getting myself back into if I picked up that phone. As the relationship slowly withered, the brutal Michigan winter finally began to ease up. The massive, dirty snowbanks along the roads slowly melted down into black roadside slush, and the overcast skies gradually gave way to longer, brighter afternoons. The early spring environment felt like a literal symbol of my own life starting to wake back up, even as the romance that had completely consumed my year bled out into total nothingness. The communication just completely dried up until it stopped altogether. We mostly just saw each other from a distance in the crowded school hallways between class periods. She seemed much quieter now, keeping entirely to herself, her face looking strangely vacant as she walked through the corridors. Right before graduation, toward the very end of the school year, the burning need for a single piece of closure finally won out over my fear. I spotted Stacy sitting alone on a concrete bench in the quiet courtyard during a free period, and I walked over, my heart doing a familiar, heavy thud against my ribs. "Hey, how are you doing?" I asked, clearing my throat and trying to sound normal. She looked up at me, completely calm, and offered an ordinary smile. "I'm doing good. What about you?" "Pretty normal," I murmured, shifting my weight. I took a slow breath, trying to steady my voice. "Look, I know this is gonna sound a bit awkward, but I really need to know this. I always wanted to know, how did you know all that? How did you always know exactly where I was?" She didn't flinch, and she didn't get angry. Instead, she just let out a small, quiet laugh, her lips curling into that same knowing smirk she used to give me back in November. She tilted her head slightly to the side, looking at me with those beautiful, unreadable eyes, and murmured, "You always worry too much, Luke. Anyway, I need to go. Take care." She wished me all the best, stood up from the bench, and calmly began walking away into the main building. Watching her leave was an incredibly sad moment for me. My chest felt totally hollow, and this heavy, painful ache settled right behind my ribs. In that exact second, the questions about how she knew things completely faded away. I didn't care about the answers anymore. I just missed her. I felt this overwhelming, desperate urge to run after her, to grab her hand, pull her back, and give her a hug, to feel that heavy, crushing hug she used to give me when I was messy. But I just stopped myself. I stood there under the pale spring sun, turned around, and forced my feet to move the other way. I knew I couldn't let myself get pulled back into that trap. So, I just walked away. I never spoke to her again. After graduation, the natural momentum of life took over, and I finally left that chaotic chapter behind me. Years began to pass in a blur. I moved away from our hometown, went to college, and eventually worked my way into project management at a digital marketing agency, building the stable life I described at the beginning of this story, and finding the kind of personal discipline I never thought possible when I was a kid, locked in a dark bedroom. Yet even after all this time, she was still in my head throughout the years. Out of a lingering, desperate curiosity, I'd occasionally find myself checking her social media platforms late at night. She was never particularly active back then, and the few abandoned profiles I managed to find were just filled with her old posts, completely frozen in time with no major updates or clues about her life. Eventually, I always closed the tab and stopped looking, but to this day, I still think about her. I know that whatever happened in my life, She was for real. And somewhere still deep down inside me, she's still there. Even now, I can't decide whether Stacy was one of the best things that ever happened to me or one of the worst. Even though my current connection with Anna is really strong, that raw intensity, that absolute feeling I got from Stacy was next to none. To this day, I still cannot understand what really was up with her. How did she know everything about me without even being around me? And most importantly, you remember the window scene from the beginning, when she actually arrived and stood on my window ledge in the middle of the night? How did she even do that? Because while I was literally talking to her on the phone right before that happened, she was at her own place, and her house is at least a 15-minute drive from mine. How did she get to my house so quickly within minutes? How did she climb up there without making a single sound? To this day, it's something that completely boggles my mind. But come to think of it, there's a part of this that bothers me more than anything else. A girl who was supposedly so deeply into me, who built this intense, overwhelming bond, and it was that easy for me to get rid of her. It just doesn't add up. Most normal relationships require massive, painful confrontations. You discuss the issues, you argue, and letting go is this agonizingly difficult process. But here, it was just a matter of me staying clean to drive her away. At one point, our connection felt so terrifyingly deep, and at the very next point, it was so incredibly shallow that all it took was being hygienic for her to just walk away forever. I completely escaped the trap and rebuilt my entire life, but the pieces of that puzzle will never make sense. I don't know where she is now, how her life is, or what she's doing. Maybe she's married, settled down somewhere. Maybe she's still out there, repeating the same strange cycle with someone else. All I know with absolute certainty is that it was real.